And just overall, how do you feel like education should play into an entrepreneur?
You know, it's kind of interesting. I don't usually associate the education that we get from colleges, from universities with entrepreneurship. I feel like it's a completely different education. If you actually look at the history of this country, pre-industrial revolution, just about everyone in America was a business owner. And today, 7% of Americans are business owners. And so people with jobs, that represents for me our modern day slave trade. And so I've got a bit of a problem with that, because I think that the education for an entrepreneur is very different than the one that we get in college, which is why when I was in college, I found that I wanted to be a doctor. And so I was doing an internship down at the hospital in Provo. I did a lot of pre-med classes, and I found that was going to set me up for a 20, 30, 40-year history, a future that I actually wasn't really enjoying. I wasn't that great at the science class. In fact, I stunk at them. The best I could produce in OChem was a B+. I that's just not good enough to get into medical school. So, I got started in real estate investing. I bought 12 homes, like you said, by the time I graduated. And I found that college for me, if I can talk directly to that, was the first step in an education towards any kind of independence, towards any kind of freedom. And it's actually the education that happens on the secondary market, like what my company represents, or like what Garrett does with teaching people financially, is the education. That's the school of hard knocks. That's the education that matters. That's the education that really gets people somewhere in life. Getting a degree is often a first step, whereas most people usually view that as a final step.
Great. Other thoughts from panelists on how education has or hasn't played into you as you founded your businesses?
I think this is one of the beauties of a panelist. Sometimes we disagree, but I agree with a lot of what Chris said, but on some things I don't. I know so many of you are used to or are familiar with the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Well, I like a lot of what's in there, and I think a lot of what he was saying is espoused in that book. But what I think one of the dangers is not everyone's cut out to be an entrepreneur. I think that's important to know. And so when he used the word slave trade, I had a problem with that. There's a lot of great professors at this university that just choose not to be entrepreneurs, but they are changing the world as much as Chris is at the end of the table. And I know if he had the chance to grab the mic, he would agree with that.
I disagree with that.
Oh, okay. This could get even more fun than I thought. But so back to the original question, is education. I do agree that it should be a stepping stone. There's no doubt. I'm completely in line with what Chris said as far as it shouldn't be the end, it should be the beginning. But I am super pro education. The stats do show that income levels go up the higher level of education you have. That's a statistic that's hard to argue. I certainly believe that the things that you learn in college, not necessarily the math problems or the history, although that gives you perspective and is important, but it lets you build skill sets. It's hard to juggle working full time and dealing with that exam that's going to be tomorrow. That will